Welcome back. This is Adbil and Jared from WolfSteel Buildings, and we're out here in Fort Worth, Texas, where we're building a commercial web truss building or web design building. A lot of people call it wide spans.
Yeah, wide span.
Something along those lines, but you're gonna love this design. This is for our tubular buildings, and we're gonna have a lot of debating today because we're gonna be talking about, the comparison between a tubular building and a red iron, especially with this type of design. I know we have a lot of things to talk about there. Galvanized frames, 14 gauge versus 12 gauge. A lot of details about this construction phase that is going on. And Jared, how you doing today, man?
A little hot. Summer's starting to kick
100
in.
degrees?
Yeah.
Hey, but we're really excited. We're super pumped. We're about to give you guys a lot of value. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And you ready for this?
I'm ready.
All right, let's go. Alrighty, Jared. Talk to me, man. I know there's construction going on, so we're probably going to be moving around as they are working because they're moving some material around. But Jared, what dimensions are we working on? Because this is a commercial storage building.
Yeah, it's a commercial storage building. For this, we're looking at a 40 wide, 50 long, and roughly 16, 17 to the eaves. The truss sits on top. With these type of buildings, if you order like a 16 tall building, right, your eave height technically for this building came out to 17.4. So something you kind of gotta account for.
Yeah, so that's because the you're saying that the truss design is about a foot tall, about a foot and 4 inches.
Yeah, so the way it works is this is what we consider your column. So your column is gonna be 16 foot tall, but your rafter sits on top of it. So for this type of web truss design, it's around a foot and 4 inches wide. That's why it came out to roughly 17.4, to the eaves. Marketing pop up the blueprints, the engineer plans for this building, and you can kind of see, for a little bit of a better explanation.
So this one's a commercial storage building. This one, we had to go through an extensive process of permitting, right? So this is all specific engineer plans. They're specific. And Pac, I want you guys to, we're going to be talking about, engineer plans. We'll get to that. But the biggest thing I want to talk about is a little bit of the process here. We actually started this process about a year ago, and he wanted a 30 wide, 50 long, and he made it last minute change. Our client just had to pull his own permit. It was just kind of a pain for him. I met him at an event, and he was telling me his problems like, hey man, it's just a little hard because like the company that I'm working with, they don't pull permits, so I had to be dealing with that. But I have a business to run, so. And I said, oh, well, we handle permitting service, so that's why we took over in the middle of the process. He was able to cancel the building with the other provider, and he came with us, and he had originally a 30 by 50s, and that's why we also did the additional concrete. You're going to see like an additional concrete that was done here.
And you can kind of see over there, once we get over there, the color in the concrete changes. I mean, I don't know exactly the difference in data 4, but I'm sure there was a good couple of months in there. You can clearly see the difference.
Exactly, even in the back. So I'm assuming, if I remember, it might have been a 30 by 40 and it was made into a 40 by 50. Just because you're sitting in the permitting process for a while, and it's kind of like, well, now that I think about it, I probably should go longer. That's exactly what our client happened here.
Well, I would say, when you're sitting in a permitting process for 6 months, you start saying, well, I only want to go through this one time, might as well go big.
Go
right?
big.
Might as well go big.
And not regret the size. Now, Jared, let's start talking about the frame design. So this is our commercial web design. This usually happens if it's 31 or greater, right?
Yeah, in open span. And clear span. So what that means is there's no middle center support. We consider that a clear span, right? From there, on our tubular buildings, what happens is whenever we go past 30 wide, now we get into this commercial style web trussing where, you're talking zigzags. It's a lot of welding. It's a lot of cutting, right? It's a lot more labor intensive, which, all kind of factors into the overall cost of the project. So that's why in some of our videos, we really specify like, hey, Tubular has that really good sweet spot. If you're looking for like a 30 by 40, 30 by 50, it's pretty cost effective because it's just the way the truss is made and designed. Whereas then once you get into even like a 32 wide, for those 2 extra, feet on your width, you get a pretty good price jump. Also, the big Skytrack that's over there adds on top of that. So now you need equipment.
So if it's like a 30 by 40, the tube can only withstand a certain design of a rafter. And that's the reason why, in order to go anything bigger than a 30, like say 31 or 32, we have to make this design to be able to withstand the wind loads.
You're saying on the column. You're saying on the column?
On the columns and the rafters.
Yeah, so another thing is for standard, depending on your wind load, obviously once you get closer to the coast or, it all varies. But for the most part, we're in Fort Worth right now. These trusses start at every 10 feet. So in a regular tubular building, usually you're starting at 5 feet and you reduce from there. In this case, since we're at 10 feet spacings, that's why even let's say if it was like a 12 tall wide span building, you would still do this type of web truss design. A, to be able to support the weight of these rafters. That's another thing. And then B, obviously, because now you're going wider, wider truss spacing, you're going to need to beef up your columns also.
So when I'm looking at this, man, so since we do red iron, this basically mimics the I-beam.
Yeah, so funny you should say that. On a 40 wide, we build them standard with 12 by 14 I-beams. So
For weld-ups.
Yeah, weld-ups. Once you get taller, then we go a little bit heavier on the pounds per foot. But for the most part, it's always like 12 by 14 I-beams.
And that's the size of this column.
And that's kind of what, we're, having to do. That's the difference between red iron and tubular. Is tubular, there's really only like 2 main frame components. And it's either a 2.5, gauge tube or 14 gauge tube or 2 1/4 12 gauge tube. And you got to find a way to beef that only singular member. Whereas in red iron, you have your I-beam, you can make it wider, you can make it heavier, and you can kind of play with it in that sense.
And let's I want to talk about 12 gauge versus 14 gauge because I know that's a big topic. However, I still want to just kind of summarize. So 30, say you're wanting just a workshop, you're wanting just a garage, and you 30 by 40, 30 by 50, 30 by 60, you can get a really good price and still meeting all the wind loads, right? And it's because definitely it's not labor intensive as is what you're seeing here, this beautiful design of columns and rafters or trusses. And you're also not dealing with equipment that you're seeing over there. So we need that equipment to raise these type of trusses. They weigh a lot, especially this is 12 gauge. This is a full 12 gauge mainframe. Okay, so anything greater than a 32, now you got equipment rental, which is about $2,500 to $4,000 or $5,000, just depending the size of the structure. And then definitely the labor intensive of doing a design like this. But overall, I am in love with this, man. And what you're seeing here, for example, is we got 4 anchor concrete wedge anchors. And then we have the L angle here to be able to add an anchor every single 10 feet. So this is all per design according to our engineer plans, right?
Exactly.
This is perfect. This is perfect. Now, let's talk about, Jared, 12 gauge and 14 gauge. This is the 12 gauge. This is the heavier. Talk to me about pros and cons of 14 gauge and 12 gauge in your opinion. This is your opinion.
I guess it depends on what you mean. Obviously, maybe one, to start off with the pros and the cons. Usually 12 gauge carries a longer rust warranty. Yeah. So I think for us right now on 12 gauge framing material, we're at a 20-year rust warranty.
Yes.
Whereas in a 14 gauge, we're at a 10-year rust warranty. Other than that, for the most part, maybe just 12 gauge is a little bit stronger. Oddly enough, from all the buildings we ran through permitting, engineered plans, if you get like a 30 by 40 building, average wind loads, usually the engineer always spaces them out at 5 feet. Doesn't matter if it's 14 gauge or 12 gauge. They kind of always just start it off at 5 feet, and they don't say, hey, if you're getting a 30 by 40 and, it's 5 foot spacings, at 14 gauge. Well, if you upgrade a 12 gauge, we can put it at 6-foot spacings. That's not how it works. Usually you never exceed 5 feet. And that's also mainly to do because of secondary framing members. Your hat channels, your purlins, your girts, they also don't want to exceed 5 feet. So that's kind of another reason.
So to summarize it, 12 gauge and 14 gauge can meet the wind loads regardless. It doesn't matter whether you do 12 gauge or 14 gauge, they're meeting the same wind loads. Like right here in this area here in Fort Worth, I think it's probably going to be 107 for category 1 to category 2, maybe 110.
I think due to the zoning of it, it might have been like 115.
That is correct. 14 gauge or 12 gauge will meet the same. 12 gauge definitely is a little bit more thicker. It's a little bit more stronger, about 8 to 12%, according to our engineer. Shout out to our team, our engineering team. So 8 to 12%. However, the size is different. So the 12 gauge is a little bit smaller, which is where the 14 gauge compensates in having a bigger.
Yeah, it's a bigger tube. So it's the 14 gauge is a 2.5 square, so 2.5 by 2.5 square. Whereas in the 12 gauge is a 2.25 by 2.25 square. It's not a huge difference, but there is a difference. Obviously, the bigger the tube, the more resistance it has.
Yep.
So I would say that might be also a reason, but it's a lot that goes into engineering that I just didn't go to school for.
Well, I'm glad we're just being very honest about it. Careful with the base trim, which is something I really do want to talk about. But I know we're still in the framing aspect, and that's just a topic. So 12 gauge, 14 gauge, 14 gauge is still a solid member. Now, if someone is getting a regular 30 by 40 and they are, there's a lot of upgrades you can do. You can do gutters, you can do, getting from horizontal to vertical. And 12 gauge, 14 gauge, what would be your recommendation if you were to recommend? I know I'm putting you on the spot like that. But what would you recommend if you were selling a project and a client had a limited budget, and where to spend that upgrade option?
That's a great question. I've given some insight on this before, but my first thing would always be to go vertical.
Yeah.
I feel like vertical, it helps with oil canning. It gives it a nicer finish. Also, yeah, these girts right here. Wide spans always are vertical. Horizontal is not really an option, just because they're 10-foot spacings. But on our smaller buildings, we add in this skirt right here, to be able to receive the screws of the sheet metal. So for me, the number one upgrade would be vertical. If you're considering horizontal or vertical sheet metal, that would be my number one upgrade. My second upgrade would be some sort of insulation. Yeah, because right now it's hot. Guys are laying out panels right now to start sheeting this up. And once they enclose this building, the panels are also kind of taking in heat, and then it's in a way trapping it inside. And man, if you don't have any insulation in your building, it can get
pretty hot.
It can get pretty hot, and just the atmosphere in there is just terrible. So especially in Texas.
So if we were in the upper north, then 12 gauge, because I used to be I did work up north. 12 gauge would be recommended if you have snow. I know we don't deal with that, but I would always recommend it for snow load, just because of the flex that the snow can produce of just the roof load.
Well, we used to live in Michigan, so we know a little bit about what's going on up there. As far as the 12 gauge or 14 gauge, that rust warranty is also invaluable up there, because, there's a lot of snow, ice, right? What do? You throw some salt down, right? And salt also can, help create rust. That's why a lot of your truck doesn't really last. Your frame starts to get rusty. You got to, maintain it a lot more. Down here, that's not as much of an issue. So maybe up north, if you're looking at something like that, that 12 gauge could be very invaluable. You're talking an extra 10 years, right, of coverage for maybe a little bit more of an upfront investment.
But overall, that it just depends on your location. But obviously, we only serve Texas. We fabricate our own buildings here in Weatherford. Yes, that's me selling our product. But we do fabricate in Weatherford, Texas. We fabricated this building, and I know you're probably seeing some of our B-roll shots while we were out there fabricating. You're seeing this beautiful building that's right now has all the skeleton, and the sheet metal is about to start going in. All right, now Jared, now we're done with the frame. If you have any questions on the frame, we're still gonna go around. We're still gonna show you guys a little bit more on the frame. But then again, this is engineered, so we're following exactly the plans. Before we get into sheet metal and base trim, which is something I really want to talk about, it's another question is like, this building is engineered, so this one has like a specific engineer plans. I know a lot of times we get some clients that call us from outside of different states, and they're like, hey, how do I trust my builder that they're doing the right thing? Or how do I know that they're building the right thing?
That's a tough one. I'm a lot on. I like watching a lot of like Instagram reels of this guy. He's like a home inspector, and he goes in and he inspects like a lot of homes, and he just finds a lot of things wrong with them in new construction. Really the best way you can protect yourself as a client that might not be as experienced, or you might not have much construction knowledge, is get an engineer involved. Trust me, your project, let's say your overall spending budget is 50 to 60,000. That's a huge investment, at least in today's market, right? 50 to 60, even 30,000, $20,000 buildings. It's a huge investment. So get an engineer involved. It might cost you a little bit more, but if you get a set of blueprints with their stamp on it, they're going to make sure it comes out right. They went to school for I don't know how long. They're not going to risk their stamp, cutting corners. Your builder might cut corners, and that's why you get the set of blueprint engineered plans, and then maybe you hire an inspector, that, comes out and knows how to read blueprints, knows how to look at, all those little things, weld marks, all that stuff, comes out and inspects your building. That's really the best advice I could give to someone that has, let's say, no connections in the construction world.
As far as this type of build, when you get a specific set of engineer plans, that's like having a third party overseeing.
Yeah, he's a median.
Peace of mind. Yes, a mediator. Jared, I know we wanted to talk about the base trim. This is one thing that I find would be really good. We have a really good scenario to explain how this base trim is very, very powerful. Do you want me to show them there first, or here?
Well, we can look at it right here. So this base trim, pretty much, the way you kind of do it is you come in and you sit this base trim down. And right there is just sitting flat. But for the most part, whenever there's any like drops or unlevelness, or really, I'll just be honest with you, concrete is never going to be perfect.
Nothing's perfect.
Nothing's perfect. It's never going to be perfect, but I would say concrete is more susceptible to imperfections, especially right now. You start pouring concrete, you have limited time to finish that concrete out and make sure, because once you start pouring, it's getting hot, it's drying, you're on a deadline, and, doesn't matter what happens, that deadline is a hard stop. There's a little bit more chances for things to go wrong in concrete, whereas in a building, we got all the time in the world. Obviously, we want to finish, but, you have a little bit more leeway to take your time, make sure, you have that leeway to measure twice and cut once. Sometimes when you're doing concrete, you don't have that luxury.
And so based on that, you're saying that's why there's going to be imperfections in concrete.
Dips, there's going to be dips, there might be a slight unlevelness. Just things like that. Your forms move around. You could set your forms and be finished with your forms on Thursday, ready to pour Friday. And from Thursday night to Friday morning, something might have moved. Yeah. So it's just things like that. So what this base trim does, it helps cover those imperfections. It also adds a little bit of color behind it to where those imperfections aren't as noticeable, and you're going to be able to see it over here on this example that Advil is going to show you.
So let me show you guys. This is the warehouse. Again, this is on a commercial. This is a commercial warehouse that's been here for a while. Okay, so I think here we can see a really good example of what we're talking about. So if we didn't have the base trim, you can see here the line of the concrete is not perfectly level. Okay, or there's a lot of factors here. It could be maybe that the sheet metal was not leveled out. Okay. But every panel is about 3 foot, and you can see here the gap between the concrete and the sheet metal is very slim, and then it got a little bit bigger, and then it got a little bit less, and then it got back to quite about closing in that gap. So the base trim is used, Jared, I know you can explain this, but the base trim, we level the base trim and sit the sheet metal on it in most cases.
Yeah, I'm gonna give the builder on this the benefit of the doubt over the concrete guys. But in this case, you know, what probably happened is that this has a slight unslope here, or slope, you know, downward this way. So what the builders had to do is, you know, right here is where your panel starts. You can see the fitment right there. It gets wider as, you know, it's over here. So this has to be level, and then this next panel, they just slide it down.
Yep.
But that just keeps going on to where on the next one, the gap gets bigger. You slide this one down, and, you know, you can kind of see that as it goes. They're pretty much adjusting to the concrete.
Yeah, and right here is where critters can come in without paying rent.
And rent's expensive nowadays.
It's expensive nowadays. That's how a base trim is powerful, because you set it, and then from there you sit your sheet metal on it. So that way it prevents from critters coming in. Some critters might try to come in from the bottom if there's a dip from the bottom of the base trim, but it's still attached and bolted to here, so it's gonna be really, really hard.
Yeah, and another thing, that's also why the foam enclosures help a lot.
That foam enclosures as well. So triple insurance, that's the biggest advantage of having this base trim. I do have another topic that I do want to talk about, is the time frame for wide spans. Is this a normal time frame to build something like this, Jared? Let's talk about the waiting time for, you know, for fabrication, and let's talk about the time frame for construction.
I'll do you one better. So let's say, how many square feet is this? 1,000 square feet. This building took around 2 to 3 weeks to fully fabricate, and that's 2,000 square feet of, let's say, building, right? Let's, you know, going back to what we're talking about over there, let's say a 30 by 60 is what? 30 by 70 is 2,100 square feet.
Yeah.
Right? That's 100 more square feet, and it only takes 2 to 3 days to fabricate. So that's why, you know, talking about it, that's why we can offer those really great deals on those 30 wide and under building tubular. Talking about lead times, usually on these wide spans or even more complicated buildings, that's why the lead time kind of goes up a little bit. It starts going up to like 4 to 5 weeks, you know, 2 to 3 weeks of fabrication, and then time to install, right, is a lot longer.
A lot longer. Right now, I think they started on Monday. A little bit around midday, and after loading, we're in Wednesday, midday. So they got 2 days. They should probably finish in like 2 more days. So they'll probably finish in like 4 days. It's still a little bit faster than a red iron weld up, right?
Yeah, they're laying out their sheet metal right now. So that's the thing with the red iron weld up is, you know, what we get delivered on site is just bare material.
Yeah.
You know, so these were fabricated in a shop. They were welded. All this cutting, welding, and everything was done in the shop. On the contrary to, you know, weld up, where all that cutting and welding is done on site. That's why it's a little bit longer to erect the weld up red iron building. Is we're starting from bare minimum. The guys for these type of buildings, they're starting at least 50% of the way there. You know, for the most part already you know, you gotta assemble it on site.
Basically pre-engineer. There's a lot we can talk about. We're gonna talk about how we use for wide spans, we don't use hat candle on the purlins. We use just a lot of tubes on the roofs. But final topic, Garrett, is galvanized. That is one big advantage of tubular buildings in general, is their frame has a coating, and that's a galvanized coating.
Yeah, so if you're ever driving down the street, you see, you know, stop signs, street signs, light signs, don't matter. A lot of that material is galvanized, and that's because it's really, you know, resistant to rusting, right? It's really resistant to rusting. Just, you know, it's some chemical. There's a bunch of different, you know, forms of it. Galvanneal, galvanized, galvalume. For us on the frame, it's galvanized steel tubing. And that's why we can offer, you know, 10, 20-year rust warranties. Whereas in red iron buildings, the reason they're called red iron is because they have a, you know, red primer to them, you know, and that's what helps it resist rusting, right? But a primer coating compared to a galvanized coating is very inferior. The galvanized coating is a lot more resistant for rust.
Resistant. It's basically, again, just bare steel dipped into like a chocolate strawberry cover. That's the analogy that I use. I hope you guys enjoyed this because this was a lot of value. I think this was a lot of information more that we don't really provide often. But again, Jared, thank you so much. I know you're very knowledgeable on this stuff. And I love having him on the channel because it allows us to really talk a little bit more in depth. A lot of the questions that you guys are probably having than just, oh yeah, well, it looks cool. Because we're going to be back out here when it's fully completed. They're still working on some already on the sheet metal part. They're going to start framing the front. There's going to be roll-up doors. Again, this is going to be a storage warehouse. Stay tuned because we're going to be talking about how they're using it for and how it looks at the end. Because I know this one's also going to have gutters and downspouts. Now, guys, we couldn't fly our drone here. We were just having some technical difficulties. But if you're going to be seeing any B-rolls, it's probably going to be some of a different frame that we did for one or other building that we just did about like a month ago out here. So just in case, because we couldn't fly our drone, guys. So I know the shots would have been perfect for this project. But aside from that, any final comments, Jared?
Comment down below if you want to see me more on the channel.
Oh, there you go.
Or who you want to see more on the channel. We're having some debates inside the office of who the fans love more.
Hey, better not let me down too. I'm just kidding, guys. But if you guys want to give us also not only who, but also, throw us some comments, throw us some questions, and we're listening. We're trying to get to them. And Metal Talks, that's where we answer a lot of those questions. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys at the finished tour.
What's up, Pack? Remember to stay up to date with everything that we're up to by checking out our social media. You can find us at WolfSteel Buildings for behind-the-scenes action. We share our latest projects, update on what the team is working on, and all the exciting progress happening in real time. Don't miss out on the action, and remember to give us a follow.